What's going on, guys? Welcome back into the channel. Today we're going to be doing a viewer requested video, but I think it is an extremely important topic to talk about, something that I think will be valuable to pretty much everybody if they're playing MLB The Show franchise mode, and that is when to cut ties with prospects within the game. You know, what type of time frame makes sense to cut ties with a player? Is it a age thing? Is it an overall thing? Is it a MLB versus AAA versus AA type of thing? Or is it something else? We'll talk about that in today's video and get down to when I tend to cut ties with players within MLB The Show. So I want to start off by saying in today's video that yes, this is a general guideline from me of when I tend to cut ties with a player, and that would be around the age of 28. If we take a look at Steven Duggar, for example, he's one of the few players on my team that would still be considered a quote-unquote prospect in that, 70 overall range that is over that age threshold. There are a couple of players here that are in that 28-year-old range. The only other one here was Carlos Sano. Those are players that I would be potentially looking to move on from or cut ties with. And what's the reasoning behind that? Well, the reasoning behind that is if you have a player that's 28 years old and hasn't quite made it to what their development potential is, there's not a lot of time left for them to actually be able to realize that development cap. And so, let's say Steven Duggar's development cap is set to be an 85. If he's 28 years old, he basically has a year or two worth of time in order to get up to an 85, which means he would need to be consistently playing at an elite level, and the game would need to favor him. Even when players play well sometimes, you don't always get the necessary boosts that you would expect from that player. And so whenever you start to get that into that 27-year-old and 28-year-old range, if the player is not nearing where you want them to be, that is when I tend to cut ties with guys. You can get a lot out of a 26-year-old, a 25-year-old, maybe even sometimes a 27-year-old because you have multiple years to develop that player into what they need to be. However, one thing that I will note is that we're talking about players that are near MLB ready, or they've been to the MLB and haven't quite turned out to be what you want them to be. We're talking about guys in the 70 overalls, but there are other times where I think it is necessary to cut ties with players. Just a quick note to throw in here, sometimes it's not necessarily quite worth throwing away these players. Like a guy like Carlos Sano is a solid AAA relief pitcher, and sometimes I will leave guys around like that just from the perspective of they can help my AAA team do well. And when the AAA team is winning, your players are going to be performing better, they're going to be playing extra games in the postseason, so they're going to have more opportunity to progress. So I don't always throw away all of those older prospects. That's just a general guideline of when I tend to move on from those players. And then another thing to mention here before we move on to what I want to talk about next is the development rating, the potential rating of a player within the game is also highly important to when you should cut ties with them. So a 28-year-old 71 overall with C potential is actually much closer to realizing his potential than another player might be. We talked about Steven Duggar, for example. He's quite a ways off from realizing his potential. His potential is in the mid to high 80s, and so he's quite a ways off from actually realizing that potential, and it's more difficult to realize that potential because when you start to get up into the 80s and 90s, then you're looking at players that are playing at an elite level, which is much harder to achieve. You're talking about the difference there between a guy that is a C potential, that is talking about a guy that's performing at most at a 79 overalls level. Well, that's not quite as difficult to achieve, and so sometimes it's more worth it to hang on to these guys that have C potential because he has a good chance, if he has two good seasons, that by the time he's 30, he could be a 79 overall, and he could find himself as a very valuable member of my bullpen within the major leagues. It also depends on position because, relief pitchers are very often few and far between, and you have a lot of them, so, a 71 overall even could potentially make the starting team. Whereas if we take a look at my center fielders, for example, I already have Joe Adell, who is prepped and ready to go and ready to take over at this position. So Steven Duggar has much less value to me, so this is a player that for those various different reasons, I would be looking to move on from more than anybody else. And then I want to say that just because a player has not performed to expectations does not mean that I cut ties with them or try to trade them away. So, for example, Tyler Fitzgerald here, he's a 25-year-old, he's a 74 overall with B potential, and he still hasn't been performing all that well. He has only batted .237 within the minor leagues. He's more of a defensive prospect anyway, so he is performing well as a defensive prospect and made, I think, the All-Star game for the minor leagues just based on his defensive performance. But this is not a player that I would move on from simply because he has had a few rough years in a row and can't get himself out of Double-A. No, he still is a 25-year-old 74 overall with B potential. If you traded for another 25-year-old 74 overall with B potential, they would have the same likelihood of turning into the player that you want them to be. So just because they're not performing all that well does not necessarily mean that you should be cutting ties with them. Now, one thing to consider is I do believe there is some truth to the fact that a change of scenery within this game can help players perform. If you watched my latest franchise video, we talked about Mitch Keller, who is now pitching much better than he was on the Pirates and is continuing to improve upon his ERA, and he's in a much less stressful environment. And so I think there is some reality to the idea of a player potentially getting a change of scenery and that improving their performance. And so from that perspective, sometimes I will move on from these guys and bring in a similar player back in return in order to just see if maybe a change of scenery for the player that we're acquiring will help them perform better and maybe they'll progress faster for me. But that is not like a guarantee. That's not something that I do on a regular basis, and therefore not something that I would recommend you guys necessarily do unless it's something you feel very strongly about, like, hey, this guy's not doing very well in my system. Let's just try to get a change of scenery for him, and we'll try to bring in somebody that could maybe have a change of scenery here. Maybe they fit my scheme better, what I'm trying to do as a team. That type of thing is normal. But then we talked about 70-plus overall players, but let's go ahead and talk about lower overall players. And let's talk about, for example, a 69 overall 27-year-old. So while this guy does not quite meet the 28-year-old requirements, you have to think about how much can this player realistically develop within a season to when he's 28. So the way that I think about how to cut ties with these players is this. So by the time this player is a 28-year-old, how high overall will he be? How good will he be? Well, by the time this guy's 28 years old, which is one season away, even if he played at an elite level down here in the minor leagues, he'd still probably only be a low to mid 70 overall prospect. So you compare that to what we talked about before, and that is tradable type of a player. And so likewise, you will want to consider that whenever you're taking a look at your players down here in the minor leagues. If you have anybody that's getting up there near like a 25-year-old right here in Nick Ames, realistically, by the time he's 28 years old, is he going to be in a position where he can capitalize on his last couple of years of development and turn himself into a good player? Let's assume something like an average of 5 overall increases per year based on an elite play level. So we're taking 3 years, add 15 overall, and you're looking at a 74 overall. So yeah, I mean, I guess he could be close to that point, but you're kind of getting a little bit risky there. If this guy was 26 years old, I'd say, yeah, go ahead and trade him away because he's probably not going to be able to get to the level that is going to be able to impact your major league team. Likewise, I would go through most of my players and think of the same thing. Relief pitcher Jake Haberer here, probably never going to get to a point where he could be that B potential. That B potential may help him develop faster, but he's only ever going to get into the 70 overalls because of where his age and overall combination lie in combination with his potential. And so those are the things that you have to consider in terms of getting rid of players. And so with that being said, you guys will see that a majority of my players on my team are younger players. They're going to be below probably 25 years old. You'll see the occasional 27-year-old sprinkled in there because I'm just keeping them around because they've performed well for the team or something like that. Generally speaking, in my minor league system, I tend to turn guys over whenever they start to get 26 years old or older, especially whenever they're getting up to that 27, 28-year-old range. They just don't have much room left to grow, in my personal opinion and my experience based on franchise mode within this game, and so that's when I tend to trade players away. Now, you guys may disagree, and that's fine. I know people run their teams differently, and I'm not saying that you're wrong. This is just how I do it, and hopefully this information is useful to somebody, or at least just gives you an idea of how I do it, and maybe gives you some ideas of how you may want to run your system, or some information on what you should generally do in terms of when your prospects are getting older, should you trade them away, and things like that. So, like I said, hopefully this information was useful to you. If it was, leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you're new, and comment down below with what you'd like to see next. I'll see you guys in the next video, and I hope you have a good one.